The Mafia boss was the undisputed king of Seoul. Feared, obeyed, unstoppable. But there was one thing even his billions couldn't buy: mercy from a fate he had already sealed. For years, he ruled with a heart as cold as gray stone, believing that power was found in the absence of empathy. Cruelty was the price others paid for his success. That afternoon, he stood in the center of his favorite luxury restaurant, his roar of rage shattering the expensive atmosphere. Before him, a young waitress trembled, a broken plate the only witness to her unforgivable mistake. Driven by a temper as sharp as a blade, the boss lunged, kicking her with the same polished Italian leather boots that had stepped over countless enemies. He watched her crumple, a nobody he never truly saw, discarded like the porcelain shards at his feet. But as he turned to leave, a sharp rush flooded his head, and the world began to tilt. The next thing he knew, he was no longer a king on a throne, but a prisoner in a clinical medical chair. The air was heavy, clinical, and reeked of focused dread. Under the cold, blue hospital lights, he stared at a test result that felt like a death warrant. A rare toxin was devouring his nerves, a silent killer that no specialist could stop. Then, the doctor spoke the words that shattered his world. His only hope, the only matching donor for a life-saving serum, wasn't a fellow titan of industry or a high-priced expert. It was her, Tessa Rowan, the very woman he had humiliated and cast aside. In that moment, the most powerful man in the city realized that his survival now lay in the hands of the one person he had tried to destroy. Stay with me until the end, and don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button, because the price she asks for his life will change everything he believes about power and revenge. The golden chandeliers of the Goryeo room didn't just provide light, they cast a halo of untouchable divinity over Kwon Min-jae. He sat at the head of a table carved from a single slab of black obsidian, the air around him thick with the scent of white truffles and the suffocating perfume of fear. In the high-stakes ecosystem of Seoul's underworld, Min-jae was the apex predator, a man whose presence turned a five-star dining experience into a silent vigil. Much like the titans of industry who had ruled before him with calculated intimidation, Min-jae's power was built on the absolute certainty that he was the only voice that mattered. To his left and right, lieutenants sat with their spines pressed hard against velvet chairs, barely touching their vintage wine. They watched his eyes, those cold, obsidian mirrors, for any flicker of displeasure. Min-jae didn't need to shout to command. He moved with a ruthless intelligence that suggested he had already played out every possible betrayal and countered it before it even formed in a traitor's mind. He was the Dragon of Seoul, and tonight, the city felt like it was resting in the palm of his hand, pulsing to the rhythm of his ambition. The Dragon's Feast was supposed to be a celebration of a newly seized shipping territory, a moment where every street corner and every business deal in the district was officially confirmed as his. The household staff and restaurant servers moved like ghosts, understanding the unspoken rules of his sanctuary. No sudden movements, no unnecessary noise. They were invisible to him, part of the expensive furniture designed to facilitate his comfort. Tessa Rowan was one of those ghosts. She moved with a quiet confidence that usually kept her beneath the radar of the volatile men she served. She had been trained to be careful, invisible, providing the service Min-jae preferred without ever demanding he acknowledge her existence. But the weight of the evening was heavy, and the tension in the room was a physical thing that could make even the most seasoned professional stumble. The accident happened in a heartbeat. As Tessa leaned in to clear a porcelain starter plate, her sleeve caught the edge of a crystal water goblet. The sound of it shattering against the obsidian table was like a gunshot in the oppressive silence of the room. The atmosphere instantly curdled. The shattered silence didn't just end the conversation, it pulled the pin on the grenade of Min-jae's temper. He didn't see a young woman working a double shift to pay for her mother's medication. He saw an unforgivable breach of his controlled reality. To Min-jae, this was a strategic disadvantage, a moment of chaos in a world that he demanded remain predictable and manageable.
He stood slowly, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor with a sound that announced his presence with lethal intent. The room grew cold. His cold, gray eyes locked onto Tessa, who had frozen, her hands trembling as she looked down at the shards. She began to whisper an apology, a sound he chose to treat as the nervous stutter of an enemy. In a world where he had built an empire on fear, Min-jae felt the need to reassert his dominance over the smallest variable. Driven by a sharp rush of adrenaline and unbridled ego, he didn't use words to dismiss her. Instead, he lunged. The shock of violence was sudden and visceral as his boot connected with her side, a brutal kick in anger that sent her sprawling across the floor. He stood over her, his mouth open in rage, a predator who had just reminded the world why he was feared. He watched her crumple, her frightened expression merely another language of fear he had learned to read with deadly precision. To him, she was still the one person he never truly saw, a minor irritation he had successfully neutralized. Min-jae straightened his perfectly tailored suit, his breathing ragged but triumphant. He looked at his men, expecting the usual nods of respect and fear. He was the king, and this was his feast. But as he prepared to sit back down and resume his rule, a strange pressure began to build behind his eyes. The urban orchestra of the restaurant, the distant hum of the kitchen, the muffled traffic outside, suddenly began to warp and shatter in his ears. The dragon had tasted blood, but the silent killer hidden within his own veins was about to prove that his invincibility was the greatest lie of all. Tessa Rowan lived her life in the margins, a master of the quiet confidence required to survive in the presence of monsters. As a waitress at the Goryo room, she was trained to be invisible, a ghost moving through a world of polished marble and crystal chandeliers. She understood the weight of the unspoken rules that governed the space around Kwon Min-jae. No direct eye contact, no unnecessary noise, and above all, never disturb the controlled and predictable sanctuary of the man at the head of the table. To the world, Tessa was just a uniform, but beneath the starched fabric, she carried the maternal concern and weathered beauty of someone who had learned to navigate hard work and harder choices. Every shift was a performance of deliberate and efficient service, a way to earn the bone china life she could never afford for herself. She watched the Dragon of Soul from her peripheral vision, noting the cold, gray eyes that seemed to rewrite verdicts with a single glance. She saw the way men twice his size trembled in his shadow, and she made herself smaller, more careful, hoping to remain part of the scenery he ignored. But the invisible victim was more observant than the titan she served. While Min-jae managed his empire through ruthless intelligence, Tessa noticed the small things, the slight tension in the shoulders of his guards, and the heavy secrets that seemed to hang over the household like a weight of expectation. She knew that in this fortress on the hill, the silence was the price paid for power, and she was willing to pay it if it meant surviving another night. The moment the goblet shattered, Tessa felt the shattered silence like a physical blow. As the porcelain shards hit the floor, her world shifted from quiet confidence to focused dread. She felt the air itself vibrate with Min-jae's rising rage, a sharp rush of violence that she had spent her life trying to avoid. When his boot connected with her side, it wasn't just a kick in anger, it was a devastating blow to her dignity, a reminder that to men like him, she was a nobody whose suffering was irrelevant. Crumpled on the marble floor, Tessa's hands trembled as she looked up at the unstoppable man who had just branded her with his cruelty. She felt the vibration through the floorboards of his heavy, authoritative click as he loomed over her, his mouth open in rage. In that moment of humiliation, she was the one person he never truly saw, a ghost in his machine of fear. Yet, as she lay there, her eyes locked onto him with an intensity that he couldn't yet interpret. She saw the stiffening of his posture and the straining of his vocal cords as he prepared to deliver a final, crushing dismissal. She noticed the subtle vocal patterns of a man whose body was starting to fail him, a tremor that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the silent killer already cancerously spreading through his system. Tessa Rowan was frightened, yes, but she was also a woman who understood the language of fear better than the man who used it as a weapon. As Min-jae turned away, treating her as a neutralized threat, She watched him with a look that asked permission from fate itself to survive. He didn't know it yet, but the invisible victim had just become the greatest miracle of his life. The power dynamic had already begun its sensory revolution, and the woman he had kicked was the only one who held the truth that could save him from the absolute silence of the grave.
The aftermath of the violence hung in the air like heavy smoke, but Kwon Min-jae was already mentally moving on, his ruthless intelligence recalibrating for the next business deal. He straightened the cuffs of his perfectly tailored suit, feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline that usually solidified his image of invincibility. To him, the invisible victim on the floor was already a ghost, a neutralized threat in a world that he demanded remain controlled and predictable. He turned away with an authoritative click of his heels, prepared to resume the dragon's feast as if nothing had happened. But then, the strategic disadvantage he had ignored within his own body began to manifest with terrifying speed. It started as a strange pressure, not unlike the sensation of being underwater, equalizing in ways that made his stomach clench with anticipation and terror. The urban orchestra of the restaurant, the distant clatter of the kitchen, and the muffled traffic outside suddenly warped. His cold, gray eyes, which had just looked upon Tessa with such disdain, began to lose their focus. The room didn't just tilt, it shattered, the crystal chandeliers above spinning into dizzying streaks of light. Min-jae stiffened as a sharp rush flooded his head, but this wasn't the rush of power he was used to. It was a silent killer, a neurological toxin, finally reaching its peak. He tried to reach for the edge of the obsidian table to steady himself, his hands trembling as he realized his absolute silence was being replaced by a high-pitched, electronic ringing. His legs, the very limbs he had just used to kick in anger, turned to water beneath him. The most powerful man in the city felt his lungs desperately gasp for air as his breathing grew ragged and frantic. He tried to call out to his trusted associate, Marco, but his voice came out as a broken whisper, his vocal cords vibrating with a weakness he had never known. The language of fear he had written across so many faces was now carved into his own as he collapsed, the Italian leather of his shoes striking the marble with a hollow, final thud. As he lay on the cold stone, the weight of consequence settled over him. He saw the ghostly reflection of the staff moving toward him, their faces masks of focused dread. Through the haze, he saw Tessa. She was no longer just a maid or a waitress. She was the one person he never truly saw, and as his world faded into a managed reality of darkness, she was the last thing his cold, gray eyes could perceive. The king had collapsed in the center of his sanctuary, and for the first time in 37 years, the fortress of his quiet was a prison he couldn't. The transition from the dragon's feast to the blue light verdict was a descent from a golden throne into a cold, sterile purgatory. When Kwon Min-jae's eyes finally flickered open, he was met not with the respectful bows of his lieutenants, but with the heavy, clinical weight of a private medical wing. The air was no longer thick with truffles and expensive wine. It was sharp with the scent of antiseptic and the focused dread of a man who has lost his grip on reality. Above him, the cold, blue hospital lights hummed with an electronic buzz that felt like a sharp rush flooding his head. He tried to sit up, but his body felt like a managed reality he no longer controlled. His limbs were heavy, anchored by 4 lines and the restraining presence of heart monitors that beeped with a frantic, ragged rhythm. He looked around the room with calculating precision, his cold, gray eyes searching for the source of this betrayal. A specialist in a crisp white coat stood at the foot of the bed, clutching a tablet like a shield. The man's vocal cords vibrated with a professional distance that couldn't quite hide his trembling hands. He spoke of a rare neurological toxin, a silent killer, that had been cancerously spreading through Min-jae's system, likely disguised in something he had consumed days prior. It was a strategic disadvantage that no amount of violence could fix. "The test result is conclusive, Mr. Kwon," the doctor whispered, his voice sounding like shattered porcelain in the quiet room. "The toxin is aggressive. It's rewriting your neural pathways. Within 48 hours, the absolute silence you feel in your limbs will reach your heart." Min-jae felt a sharp pressure behind his eyes. He had built an empire on fear, believing himself unstoppable. But here, under the blue light revelations, he was just a man with a ticking clock in his chest. He demanded a cure, his voice a broken whisper that lacked its usual authoritative click. He offered billions, threatened absolute destruction, and promised a world of pain if he wasn't healed. The doctor simply shook his head, looking toward a ghostly reflection in the observation glass. Money cannot synthesize the serum you need in time. It requires a specific, rare blood match, a natural antibody found only in someone who has survived a localized exposure to the same strain. We've scanned the national database. There is only one match within 500 miles. Min Jae's obsidian mirrors narrowed. Who? He rasped, the texture of human speech feeling like sandpaper in his throat. The doctor hesitated, his eyes locked onto the ear of the man he feared. Her name is Tessa Rowan. She was admitted to the emergency clinic just an hour after your incident at the restaurant. It seems she had a trace amount of the toxin on her skin, perhaps from the broken glass, and her body produced the very miracle you need to survive. The irony hit Min Jae with the force of a physical blow. The invisible victim, the nobody he had discarded with a kick in anger, was now the only bridge between him and the grave. The power imbalance had not just shifted, it had inverted. In the shattered silence of the hospital room, the most powerful man in Seoul realized that his invincibility was a lie, and his life was now a weight of consequence, resting in the hands of the woman he had tried to break. He looked through the glass, seeing a ghostly overlay of the waitress standing in a nearby ward, her frightened expression now replaced by a quiet confidence he had never bothered to notice. The dragon was trapped in a cage of blue light, and for the first time in 37 years, he had to learn the language of mercy or perish in the quiet. Kwon Min Jae did not accept the word impossible. In his world, that was simply a starting price for a higher bribe or a more creative threat. As he lay beneath the cold, blue hospital lights, his mind worked with the calculating precision that had built his criminal empire. He refused to believe that his life hung on the trembling hands of a waitress he had discarded like trash. To a man who ruled through calculated intimidation, the idea of being a supplicant was a strategic disadvantage he could not tolerate. Find another, Min Jae rasped, the texture of human speech still foreign and jagged in his throat. He looked at Marco, his most trusted associate, who stood by the door like a gargoyle. Scour the city, the country. Find a donor who isn't her. Marco moved with deliberate and efficient speed. Within the hour, the resources of the Kwon Syndicate were unleashed. Private jets were readied, and high-priced specialists were summoned from across the globe, their vocal patterns of deception filtered through the phones of panicked subordinates. Min Jae's absolute silence was replaced by the urban orchestra of a desperate search. He authorized donations to medical boards and whispered conversations with black market organ brokers, willing to spend billions to avoid the weight of consequence that came with facing Tessa Rowan. But as the hours ticked away, the miracle he sought remained out of reach. One by one, the reports came back with the same focused dread. The toxin was too specific, the neurological strain too rare. The silent killer in his blood was a custom-made lock, and Tessa was the only key. Every other potential donor was a strategic failure, their blood types shattering against the compatibility tests. Min Jae watched the ghostly reflection of the medical monitors, the ragged rhythm of his heart a constant reminder of his fading invincibility. He was the Dragon of Seoul, a man who commanded everything, yet he was currently being checkmated by a nobody. His pride was a fortress of quiet that was rapidly becoming his tomb. He tried to focus on his ruthless intelligence, searching for a manufactured disadvantage he could exploit, but the blue light revelations offered no escape. By midnight, the absolute silence of the hospital corridor was broken by Marco's return. The big man didn't need to speak. The slight tension in his shoulders told the story. There was no proxy. There was no miraculous third option. The search had yielded nothing but the absolute certainty that Min Jae was dying. The specialists, they say we are out of time, boss, Marco whispered, his voice sounding like shattered porcelain in the clinical room. The toxin is It's cancerously spreading. If we don't start the extraction from the Rowan girl within the next 6 hours, the damage will be irreversible. Min-jae stiffened, a sharp rush of pure, unadulterated fury flooding his head. He felt the sensory revolution of his own mortality. He was a man who preferred invisible help, yet he was now forced to look at the one person he never truly saw as his savior. The power imbalance was no longer a theory, it was a physical blow. He looked through the glass partition toward the ward where Tessa was being held for observation. She was quiet, a ghostly overlay in the dim light of the hallway. He realized that his empire built on fear was useless here. Money could buy obediency and unstoppable loyalty, but it could not buy the natural miracle flowing through the veins of the woman he had kicked in a fit of pride. The dragon was cornered. For the first time in 37 years, Kwon Min-jae understood that silence was the price he could no longer afford to pay. He would have to face her. He would have to step out of his study of power and into the vulnerable reality of a man begging for his life. The search for a proxy had ended in a deadly silence, leaving him with only one path, a path that led directly to the waitress who held his last words in her hands. Through the reinforced observation window of his private suite, Kwon Min-jae watched the ghostly reflection of the woman who had become his unintended judge. Tessa Rowan sat in a plastic chair in the hallway, her posture a stark contrast to the furious outburst he had unleashed upon her hours ago. She looked small, framed by the cold, blue light of the hospital corridor, but to Min-jae, she now carried the weight of a miracle. He watched her through the glass, a fortress of quiet separating them, realizing that he was finally seeing the person he had spent a lifetime treating as invisible. She was bandaged where his Italian leather boot had left its mark, a physical manifestation of his ruthless intelligence turned into a strategic disadvantage. Every time she winced, Min-jae felt a sharp rush of something he hadn't experienced in 37 years, genuine, unadulterated vulnerability. He was the Dragon of Soul, a man who commanded everything, yet he was currently a prisoner of his own cruelty. The power imbalance was no longer a theoretical concept, it was a physical blow that left him breathless. From his bed, he observed her quiet confidence. Even in her pain, there was a weathered beauty to her resilience, a maternal concern she seemed to radiate toward the nurses who passed her. She wasn't shouting or demanding retribution. She was simply existing in a space where her very blood match was the only thing keeping the most feared man in the city from absolute silence. Min-jae felt his stomach clench with anticipation and terror. He was used to whispered conversations about hits and hostile takeovers, but he had no language for the miraculous act of compassion he now required. He reached out, his hands trembling, to touch the glass. The surface was cold, a clinical barrier that mirrored the heart of stone he had built his empire upon. In the shattered silence of the room, the only sound was the ragged rhythm of his heart monitor, a ticking clock counting down the irreversible damage of the toxin. He watched Tessa's ghostly overlay against his own reflection, a predator and a victim merged into a single image of focused dread. He realized then that he had lived his entire life in a managed reality where everyone wanted something from him or feared him. But Tessa wanted nothing. She didn't even know that the man who had humiliated her was dying just a few feet away. The irony of fate was a bitter pill. He had ruled through fear, yet fear was the one thing that wouldn't save him now. Only the one person he never truly saw possessed the truth of his survival. As he watched her, a sensory revolution occurred within him. He stopped seeing a nobody or a waitress and began to see the absolute certainty of his own humanity reflected in her suffering. The dragon was beginning to realize that power built on silence was a brittle thing, easily shattered by a single act of the very person he had tried to break. He was no longer looking at a ghost in the glass, he was looking at his only hope for a resurrection. The absolute silence of the room was suddenly broken by the sound of the door latch. Marco entered, his slight tension in the shoulders signaling that the time for observation was over. The search for a proxy had failed, and the blue light verdict was final. Min-jae turned his eyes from the glass back to his associate, his vocal cords vibrating with a new, hollow weight. "Bring her in," he whispered, his voice a broken segment of the authority it once held. "Bring her in and tell the doctors to prepare for the extraction. But first, I need to look her in the eye without the glass between us." He knew that the next few minutes would either be his last words or the start of a new empire built on something far more dangerous than fear, a debt of life to the woman he had kicked in the dark. The heavy door to the private suite creaked open, a sound that once would have been lost in the absolute silence of Kwon Min-jae's world, but now grated against his nerves like a sharp rush of static. Marco escorted Tessa Rowan into the room. She moved with a quiet confidence that seemed to defy the cold, clinical setting, her eyes locked onto the floor until she was stood directly before the bed. Min-jae watched her, his obsidian mirrors searching for the fear he had spent a lifetime cultivating, but all he found was a weathered beauty and a profound, silent exhaustion.
"Leave us," Min-jae rasped, his vocal cords vibrating with a command that he expected to be final. Marco hesitated, his slight tension in the shoulders betraying his concern, before retreating into the hallway. The silence that followed was not the fortress of quiet Min-jae was used to. It was a shattered silence, heavy with the weight of consequence. He looked at the waitress, the woman whose life he had tried to neutralize with a single kick in anger, and felt the strategic disadvantage of his own mortality. He needed the extraction. He needed the miracle flowing through her veins. And as a man who had commanded everything for 37 years, he knew only one way to get it. "You know why you're here," Min-jae began, his voice regaining a fraction of its authoritative click. He didn't look at her with maternal concern, he looked at her with the calculating precision of a boss closing a deal. "The doctors say you have what I need. My associates will ensure your family is taken care of. You will receive a sum of money that will make this incident at the restaurant a distant memory. You will sit in that chair, you will give them the blood, and you will forget my name." It was a failed command before it even left his lips. Tessa didn't flinch. She didn't tremble as she had when the porcelain shards hit the floor. Instead, she slowly raised her head, her eyes meeting his cold, gray mirrors with a clarity that felt like a physical blow. "No," she said. The word was small, but it shattered the room more effectively than his outburst ever had. Min-jae stiffened, a sharp rush of disbelief flooding his head. "No," he repeated, the texture of human speech failing him. "You don't understand the power imbalance here, girl. I am not asking. This is an absolute certainty. You will do as you are told, or the absolute destruction of everything you hold dear will be the only thing left of your life." He expected her to break. He expected the language of fear to take hold. But Tessa stepped closer to the bed, her hands no longer trembling. "You think your money can buy a miracle," she whispered, her voice sounding like shattered porcelain in the clinical room. "You think you can kick me like a dog and then command me to save you? I saw the way you looked at me in that restaurant. I was a nobody to you. A ghost you didn't even bother to see. And now you want the very life you tried to stomp out." Min-jae tried to reach for the restraining presence of his authority, but his body betrayed him. A sharp pressure surged behind his eyes as his heart monitor began its ragged rhythm. He realized with a focused dread that his threats were hollow. He was a king in a medical chair, and she was the only one who held the truth of his survival. "I have billions," he gasped, his lungs desperately gasping for air. "I can make you a queen." "I don't want to be a queen," Tessa replied, her quiet confidence now an unstoppable force. "I want to know that the man I'm saving actually has a soul worth the blood I'm giving. You tried to command me, Mr. Kwon. But you forgot one thing. In this room, under these blue light revelations, you aren't the dragon. You're just a dying man who can't even stand on the legs he used to hurt me." The failed command hung in the air, a manufactured disadvantage of his own making. Min-jae realized that power built on silence and fear was useless against a woman who had already lost her fear of him. The dragon was cornered, not by an enemy syndicate, but by his own ruthless intelligence, which had failed to account for human dignity. If he wanted to live, he would have to do the one thing he had never done. He would have to stop commanding and start listening. The clinical room fell into a silence so heavy it felt like a physical blow. Min-jae lay back against the pillows, his lungs desperately gasping for air, as the ragged rhythm of the heart monitor signaled his fading strength. The failed command had been his last weapon, and it had shattered in his hand. For the first time, he stopped looking at Tessa as a strategic disadvantage or a proxy for his survival. He looked at her and truly heard the absolute silence of his own soul. "I didn't see you," Min-jae whispered. The words weren't a command. They were a broken segment of a man finally facing the weight of consequence. The texture of human speech felt raw in his throat, no longer shielded by the authoritative click of his previous life. In the restaurant, "I only saw a mistake. I didn't see a person." Tessa stood by the medical chair, her hands resting on the cold metal rail. She didn't look away. Instead, she let him hear the sound of mercy, not a grand proclamation, but a quiet, devastating truth. "You kicked me because you could," she said, her voice sounding like shattered porcelain in the blue-lit room. "You spent 37 years building a fortress of quiet where no one could touch you, no one could hurt you. But you turned that fortress into a prison, Mr. Kwon. You became so unstoppable that you stopped being human." Min-jae stiffened as a sharp rush of realization flooded his head. He had spent his life believing that silence was the price paid for power, but as he looked at Tessa, he realized the price had been his own humanity. He had viewed the world with calculating precision, but he had missed the urban orchestra of empathy. He saw the bruise on her arm, a dark mark of his ruthless intelligence, and felt a sharp pressure behind his eyes that had nothing to do with the toxin. "I am a monster," he rasped, his obsidian mirrors finally cracking. Tessa reached out, her hands no longer trembling. She placed a palm over his, where the foreline entered his vein. The contact was a sensory revolution. It wasn't the restraining presence of his guards or the focused dread of his enemies. It was warm. It was real. "The toxin is making you feel the absolute silence of death," she whispered, her maternal concern finally breaking through his managed reality. "But the mercy I'm giving you, it's not for the boss. It's for the man who is terrified of being alone in the dark. I will give you the blood, not because you commanded it and not for your billions. I'm doing it because if I don't, then the shock of violence you started in that restaurant is the only thing that wins." The power imbalance dissolved in that moment. Min-jae felt a miraculous shift in the air. He wasn't the dragon, and she wasn't the victim. They were two people in a blue light revelation, one offering a miracle and the other finally learning to receive it. He heard her breath, steady and rhythmic, and for the first time in his life, he understood that power built on silence was nothing compared to the sound of mercy. "Thank you," he breathed. The two words were his last words as the man he used to be. As the doctors entered the room to begin the extraction, Min-jae closed his eyes, no longer fighting the absolute silence. He listened to the vibration through the floorboards of the medical equipment, feeling the surgical precision of the care he was about to receive. He wasn't just being saved from a silent killer, he was being brought back to a world where he could finally hear the laughter and the music he had ignored for decades. The dragon was dying, but in the shattered silence of the hospital room, something new was being born. The clinical atmosphere of the room shifted into a state of surgical precision as the medical team began the delicate process of the extraction. The air hummed with the ragged rhythm of advanced machinery, but the true pulse of the room was the miraculous connection between two people lying on adjacent beds. Kwon Min-jae, the man who had built a fortress of quiet out of pride and violence, now watched through a ghostly reflection as the life-saving antibodies were drawn from the woman he had tried to break. Tessa lay still, her quiet confidence serving as an anchor in the storm of medical activity. As the tubes began to carry her blood toward the filtration unit, she didn't look at the boss with the focused dread of a victim, but with a weathered beauty that came from a place of profound moral strength. Min-jae watched the texture of the liquid moving through the lines, realizing that his absolute silence was about to be replaced by a second chance he didn't deserve. The power imbalance had reached its final, most literal stage. His heart was literally waiting on hers to beat. The sensory revolution continued within him as the first of the processed serum began to enter his own veins. It wasn't just a medical treatment. It felt like a sharp rush of humanity flooding back into a cold, gray world. He could feel the silent killer, the toxin that had been cancerously spreading, retreating as Tessa's resilience went to war on his behalf. The stiffening in his limbs began to soften, and the sharp pressure behind his eyes subsided, leaving behind a clarity that was both miraculous and terrifying. He looked over at her, his vocal cords vibrating with a sensation that was no longer authoritative but deeply humbled. He saw the slight tension in her shoulders as the procedure took its toll on her energy, and for the first time in 37 years, he felt the maternal concern of a man who realized that every breath he took was a whispered conversation of debt to another soul. He was no longer the dragon. He was a broken segment of a person being put back together by the very miracle he had once stepped on. The doctors moved with deliberate and efficient speed, their vocal patterns hushed in respect of the strange, heavy peace in the room. They monitored the vibration through the floorboards of the life support systems, ensuring the extraction was perfect. Min-jae closed his eyes, listening to the urban orchestra of the hospital, the distant sirens, the hum of the lights, the soft footsteps of the nurses. He realized that the shattered silence of his previous life was gone, replaced by a soundtrack of mercy that he would have to learn to live by. By the time the final bag of serum was hung, the blue light verdict had been overturned. The dragon had survived, but the man who would walk out of this room would never be the same. He looked at Tessa one last time before she was wheeled out for recovery, her hands no longer trembling, and he made a silent vow. The absolute destruction he had once promised the world would be replaced by something else. He had been rescued from the dark by the one person he never truly saw, and as he felt the warmth of her life force stabilizing his own, he understood that the greatest miracle wasn't just surviving, it was being changed. The extraction was complete, leaving Min-jae with a heart that finally knew how to beat for someone other than himself. The clinical blue of the hospital was eventually replaced by the warm, amber glow of Kwon Min-jae's private study, but the man who sat behind the black obsidian desk was no longer the one who had left it. The absolute silence that once defined his reign had been permanently shattered. Now he sat with the windows open, listening to the urban orchestra of Seoul, the distant hum of traffic, the rustle of the wind through the ginkgo trees, and the steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock. For the first time in 37 years, he wasn't just observing the world with calculating precision, he was truly hearing it. His recovery had been a sensory revolution. As the silent killer was flushed from his system by the miraculous serum, his ruthless intelligence had undergone a transformation. He no longer sought absolute destruction for those who crossed him. Instead, he looked for the vocal patterns of deception in his associates and the whispered conversations of his rivals with a new, nuanced understanding. He realized that power built on silence was brittle, but power built on the truth was unstoppable. His first act upon returning to the streets was to visit a small, unassuming apartment on the edge of the district. He didn't arrive with a furious outburst or a fleet of armored SUVs. He came alone, his Italian leather shoes clicking softly on the pavement. He found Tessa Rowan there, her quiet confidence intact, though her eyes still held the weight of consequence from their shared ordeal. There was no command this time. Min-jae stood before the woman he had once neutralized with a kick in anger and handed her a document. It wasn't a bribe to ensure her absolute silence, nor was it a strategic disadvantage meant to tie her to his crimes. It was the deed to a new medical clinic, fully funded and staffed, bearing her name. The dragon is dead, he told her, his vocal cords vibrating with a sincerity that no one in the syndicate had ever heard. But the empire remains. Only now, it will be built on the soundtrack of mercy you gave me. Tessa looked at the document, then back at the man who had been her invisible tormentor. She saw the maternal concern he now felt for the city he ruled, a resurrection of humanity that had begun in a blue-lit medical chair. She didn't offer him a ghostly reflection of his past. She offered him a nod of miraculous acceptance. As Min-jae walked back to his car, he felt the vibration through the floorboards of the city. His new empire would be different. He would still be feared and obeyed, but he would also be a man who listened. He understood now that the greatest miracle of his life hadn't just been surviving a silent killer, but being forced to see, and hear, the people he had spent a lifetime treating as ghosts. The power imbalance had been corrected. Quan Minjae was no longer a king in a fortress of quiet. He was a leader in a world full of music and laughter, and as he drove through the neon-lit streets of Seoul, he realized that silence was a price he would never be willing to pay again. The Dragon's Feast was over and a new era of truth and consequence had begun.